So my name is Philip Oxhorn. I'm a professor of political science, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Study of International Development. And it's really a privilege and an honor for us to host the Canadian launch of a very important book. You know, ISID was founded about 7 years ago with a basic idea that we would try and connect the worlds of academia, of research and theory, with a real world of problem solving and helping to make it a better place for everybody. As part of that, for a number of years, we've been associating ourselves with a variety of people that we call professors of practice, people who have been there and done that and have tremendous expertise that they bring to the campus, helping us to set our compass right so that we can complete our mission of really making ourselves relevant to the real world. Michael Brown was one of our first professors of practice, and this launch is really a culmination of an ongoing relationship with Michael and through Michael, the UNEP, and other related organizations. The thing that's particularly good from our perspective about this book and this project is the idea that if we can mediate conflict before it escalates, a lot of people will live a better life. And I think that it's a problem that is suited for the kind of work we try and do with the Institute for the simple reason that there's probably nothing more important, but at the same time more complicated than trying to avoid crises before they blow up in our face. The positive thing, too, is that what we see constantly, whether we want to or not, is the damage and the violence of all sorts that conflict can cause. Looking at global warming, looking at food security, looking at all sorts of issues in the world, the probability is we're going to, more likely than not, to see more and more conflict. And what we forget is that there are ways of avoiding those explosions if we reach out early and effectively through things like mediation. And so for us, the goal here is to present this book to you and we see it as a foundation for bigger and better things to come for ISID, for UNEP, working with them in trying to make conflicts more of a thing of the past than they might otherwise be. With that said, I'd like to hand over the floor to my colleague, Professor Daniel Jutra, the Dean of the Faculty of Law.
Thank you, Phil. You've taken out the first two sentences of my speech. I was going to say my name is Daniel Jutra, I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Law, but I guess that's done already. Je suis très heureux d'être ici ce soir. En général, je pense qu'on va dire le plus souvent que quand il y a des conflits, quand il y a des dilemmes à résoudre, ce n'est pas une bonne idée d'inviter les avocats. Turns out that that's a myth. I see a lot of our students in the faculty sitting here. I see two of my colleagues, Louise Atis and François Crépeau, sitting in front. And I'm here to confirm, I think, for those of you who don't know, that lawyers are about dispute resolution in any way in which it can take shape. And the phenomenon of conciliation, mediation, and negotiation, I think, is now a central part of the training and education of lawyers. And this is why I'm so delighted to be here to participate in this effort to convey the significance of mediation as a mode of dispute resolution on the international scene. In law schools, students will encounter mediation in different settings. They will envisage mediation at the very micro level, in family conflicts and neighborhood conflicts. But I think the basic ideas are easily conveyed in other settings, and most significantly in the context of international conflict. So I'm very happy, actually, to be given this opportunity to speak. And as you can imagine, I was given an advance copy of the book in anticipation of this and felt like I kind of had to read it because this is not my expertise. I'm not at all involved in international law. But I was really impressed with that document because it touches on so many of the crucial issues that occupy the minds of many of my colleagues and the minds of many of my students. The students, as you know here, are the next generation of public actors and governance experts, and I know that they will be delighted to see the transformation that is brought about by documents like the one that we're exploring today. This guide, in my mind, having read it, is really very rich, timely, and effective in at least three ways, and I want to point out very briefly what I see in there, which is extremely interesting. From my point of view, as I'm expert, so to speak, in private law, contracts, and torts, and not at all in international law. But from my point of view, one of the great contributions of this book is the ways in which, through very clear examples and case studies, the book draws the inescapable connection between conflict and natural resources management and natural resources, access to natural resources. This is a connection that's absolutely fundamental. I think it's well known by people who work deeply in international conflict and humanitarian efforts, but not well known, I think, more broadly. People tend to think about conflict as primarily politically driven in the narrow sense, and not necessarily driven by concern for access to very basic resources that are so significant in people's lives. I think the book is very significant in that respect, in pointing out the role of dispute resolution on these matters on our way to world peace. Let's hope for that. The second way in which that book struck me as really crucial and valid is that it's really informed by practice and concrete experience. I think that's one thing that's quite special about this book. It includes vignettes and case studies that I would encourage you to look at, because obviously dispute resolution, more specifically mediation, are rooted in experience. This is something that can only happen with very concrete, or attention to the concrete details of the circumstances of the people who are involved, their interests, and the ability to listen and to pick up on the key dimensions of their experience is one of the crucial factors in resolving those disputes. And I think this book really makes the case very clearly that practice and concrete experience are central to mediation. The third way and last way in which I thought this book was really fascinating is that it's a compelling demonstration of the significance of context in the wider sense. This is something, as many of you know, that is one of the drivers of the Faculty of Law, the theoretical efforts in the Faculty of Law. Much of the research in the Faculty of Law focuses on legal pluralism. François Crépeau is the director of the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, and we think in the Faculty of Law that it's absolutely essential to think about conflict in context, to think about the ways in which plurality of perspectives, cultures, experiences relate to the way in which individuals interact in the world, to think well beyond formal circumstances of law and institutions, to understand in the lived context how people can achieve their aspirations. And so I'm very happy to see this book launched at McGill. I understand there are only 2 academic institutions in which the book will be launched. One is, Harvard, I think. Yeah, I think it's Harvard. Yeah, and the other one is this one. So I'm very proud that this is happening here at McGill, and very happy that the Faculty of Law has an opportunity to be associated with such a worthy project. The faculty is, I think, one of the primary sites for international law in North America and the world, most certainly the most significant research institution in legal pluralism, but it's also one that is truly committed to public service in the resolution of real problems on the global and the local scene. And you have, with Louise Atis, my 2 colleagues, Louise Atis and François Crépeau, very good examples of people who are involved in the world and committed to dispute resolution. So I salute the authors of that book, in particular the 2 that we have with us. I think the 2 primary contributors, Michael Brown and David Jensen, and I wish you a great evening. I will have to run out at some point. Don't think that it's because I'm uninterested. I had warned the organizers that I had a conflict tonight, but I know that you will stay until the end. Thank you.
Well, thank you for those opening remarks. My name is David Jensen. I'm with the UN Environment Program, and for the last 15 years, I've been working on this link between natural resources, conflict, and peace building. Now, just in case you hear a particular accent, I do also come from Canada, from the west side. I'm from BC. I grew up in Victoria, and I studied geography, and I studied political science and economics, so I have a bit of an interdisciplinary background. Before I start, I just wanted to know who we have in the audience. I want this to be interactive, so I want to know who you are. So just hands up very quickly. Who do we have from the law faculty? Okay, geography. Political science. Economics. Oh, only 2, 3. Okay, sociology? No, okay, and what have I missed? Just shout them out. Natural resources. Oh, I missed natural resources. IDS, what's IDS? Okay, fantastic. So I think the point is that mediation is fundamentally an interdisciplinary approach. It requires a multitude of different approaches and backgrounds, and that's a key message to keep in mind. So before I actually introduce the panelists, I wanted to give a bit of background on why we did this publication and this report, why we started this work. And it's basically three parts to the story. UNEP had been working in the field looking at the environmental impacts of conflicts. So after a big conflict, we'd go in with experts and we'd look to see how a conflict damaged the environment and damaged natural resources. But as we were doing this over a number of years, we realized that very few people in the UN system were looking at the drivers of conflict and how natural resources were driving conflict, and also how they were potentially contributing to peace building. So there was a big gap. And we started actually looking at all the conflicts around the world, and we determined that about 40 to 60% have a resource link. So almost half of all national conflicts, in one way or another, are linked to natural resources. And so we began to ask inside the system, well, who has the right mandate? Who actually has the mandate to deal with natural resources in conflict? And we went to the political side of the system, and we went to all the other technical agencies, and basically the answer was, well, nobody. Nobody has a mandate for looking at mediation of natural resource conflicts. DPA, the Department of Political Affairs, they mediate, but mostly political issues. And UNEP, we obviously have a technical role in natural resources, but there was nobody bringing these two worlds together, and we thought this was a big gap. This was a gap that needed to be plugged. And so we set about to create this partnership with the political side to actually try to identify what good practice is in mediating resource conflicts and how we can take this forward together between the two parts of the system. So that was one reason. There was a big gap. It was falling through the cracks of the international system. The second reason is that as UNEP, we were getting more and more requests from countries to help on their own natural resource conflicts. A lot of conflicts between countries over water. A couple of examples, Afghanistan and Iran were asking us to help on mediation of a transboundary water conflict. Iraq and Iran were also asking for help. We had Palestine, Israel, we had North Sudan, South Sudan. So we were getting more and more requests to intervene on resource conflicts and to help mediate them. And we started doing that without a real sense of good practice. So in a sense, we were making it up as we went along. And we really thought we should collect good practice and figure out how to do this in the best way possible. So part of it was also building up our own capacity and really understanding what good practice was. And then finally, we could see this as an issue going forward. We could see more and more demand for this kind of capacity, and we really thought we should develop a new institutional mechanism to actually address it. And so basically we wanted to find partners around the world that we could work together with. We wanted to find experts that we could work together with going forward. So part of this was also looking forward and trying to build up new capacity to address it. And this is why we're very happy to have found McGill and experts like Michael and other experts in the room that we can work with going forward. So those were the three reasons for the report. So as I said, we basically reached out across the system, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but in fact it is, as UNEP, going into the technical side of the house, reaching into the political side, saying, hey, let's collaborate on this. It's actually a very rare thing, unfortunately. But we reached out into the political side. We joined forces. We brought together around 40 of the world's experts dealing with resource conflict mediation. We documented their experiences, and the product that was held up before is what is the outcome of the work. And I think there are copies in the back, or there should be copies available. So that's the basic background, and Michael will take you through the actual content. So before he does that, I just wanted to introduce the panel. And as I said, at some point, it's a high-level panel, it's a star-studded panel, and really it should be an excellent discussion. I think the panel collectively has experiences from around 30 conflict-affected countries, so there's a lot of excellent field experience. We have a mediator, we have government expertise, we have a former judge, we have expertise coming from the community side, the academic, the private sector, so we have an excellent assemblage of all the voices you might want to hear around mediation. So in terms of the panelists, the first, Louise Otis, on the very end there. She's a retired justice of the Quebec Court of Appeal, the adjunct president of the Administrative Tribunal of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, president of the Court of Appeal of the Court at the International Organization of la Francophonie, and adjunct professor in the Faculty of Law at McGill University. So Fantastic to have you here. Thank you very much. Next, we have Jeffrey Davidson. He is the Extractive Sector Corporate Social Responsibility Counselor for Canada, and he's been involved with mining and mineral resource development for the past 35 years in one capacity or another. He's a project engineer, a policy program advisor, a community worker, and a professor. Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for joining us. Third, we have François Crépeau, Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. He's the Director of the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, Professor and Oppenheimer Chair in Public International Law in the Faculty of Law at McGill University. Thank you very much. And Michael Brown, Senior Natural Resource Specialist and Mediation Expert. Michael is presently Professor of Practice in Natural Resource Conflict Mediation here at McGill. He was also the Senior Expert on the Natural Resources and Land Standby Team, and he is one of the principal authors of the guide. So just a quick round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much. So we are about to begin our panel, but before that, there's a few ground rules and a few thank yous I must say. So first of all, we are videotaping. There will be a summary of the report after the event, but what that means is it's not Chatham House rules, so it will be quotable, and as I said, it will be videotaped. Sorry? Oh, sorry. So I want to have a really dynamic discussion, so do prepare some questions. There will be moments where I will be asking from the audience for questions, so please start thinking about them now, really tough ones. I will also be engaging from time to time with follow-up questions, so we want to keep it as fluid as we possibly can. So what we're going to do is we're going to start. Michael, he's going to give a 10-minute overview of the guide, just walking you through the basics of what we tried to do, how it's laid out. Then each of our panelists is going to provide a 10-minute response in terms of how the guide resonates with their own experiences. What are the parts of the guide that actually speak to their backgrounds? What do they think we got right, and what did we maybe miss out on, or what did we get wrong? So each of the panelists is going to speak from their own experience and reflect on the guide themselves. We're going to start with Louise, and then move on to Jeffrey. Then we'll have a pause for a couple of questions, and then we'll move on to Francois, Michael, another round of questions. We'll then close at around, I'm going to try to wrap up at around 6:50. We'll start wrapping it up around 6:50, and we'll try to end by 7 if we can. I've been requested to try to keep a good rein on time. I'll do my best. So just before we start the panel discussions, a few words of thanks. Again, I'd like to thank very much McGill University for hosting the event, Phil Oxhorn in particular, and the Institute for the Study of International Development, Daniel Jutras as well, Dean of the Faculty of Law, for the support. And I want to just point out that this is not the first time UNEP and McGill have collaborated. We've collaborated multiple times, in fact. We had a joint center on environmental assessment that we worked with in collaboration with Dr. Michel Bouchard for a number of years. The second big collaboration we had was around environmental peace building, and John Unruh. We had lots of collaboration with John, and not to do any marketing, but this is one of the outcomes. This is one of John's books. And McGill's logo is right there on the back, so this is... and then finally, we have the new collaboration with Michael and with other colleagues, including John, on the mediation guide. So it's a long history of collaboration. We're very proud to have this. Finally, I need to thank two other individuals, the government of Finland, primarily the financial supporter for the guide, together with Italy and the European Union. And then finally, I think I really want to thank Justin Trudeau. I have seen the letter he has sent to his new ministers, committing Canada to re-engage in multilateral institutions and committing Canada to re-engage in peace-building, mediation, and peacekeeping. And I think that's a fantastic commitment. We're very happy to see that. And part of this discussion should really be asking, well, how can this particular process, how can this particular guide help feed Canada's new vision? So let's have that in mind as we have this discussion. So on that note, I'd like to hand it over to Michael, and we'll start going through the guide itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I'm going to start off here and give a bit of an overview of the guide, and I'll be talking a little later some experiences from the field. A little bit of background context, I'll walk through the guide, and then a few closing remarks. In terms of background context, I've been doing this stuff for about 20 years in the international system, and in a range of contexts and countries, and I've been watching and participating in the evolution of this field of resource mediation in the international context. And I thought I'd share, just to start off, a kind of personal experience observation as it's been evolving. I started working on these issues back in Canada, but was pulled into the international setting in the mid-1990s into the Guatemalan peace process. And in 1996, there's the signing of the peace agreement. It's a 36-year-long civil war. Land and natural resources and questions about land and indigenous rights were at the heart of what caused and drove the civil war. There were a series of robust peace agreements coming out of it, and land, resources, and indigenous rights were at the heart of the peace agreements. And in that peace process, there was extensive engagement around issues of mediation, dialogue, bringing people together across issues of difference, and trying to look at how do you resolve a lot of these disputes. Those of us who are working on it were largely making things up as we went. Some of us were bringing some experience from other jurisdictions where some of this had been happening, but not in contexts, post-conflict settings, contexts of such weak governance, weak rule of law. And if I now think sort of 20 years later, fast forward it, we've been developing experience in the international domain on doing this stuff. We've been learning about what works and what doesn't. And that's where the UN's new guide comes in. It is consolidating decades of hands-on experience of how we do this stuff in the international context. Now, I guess a few points about why the UN put it together. David talked kind of big picture, but there are a few sort of key critical points that explain it. The first is that there's an acute awareness that natural resource conflicts are increasing for a range of different reasons. Secondly, there's a recognition that natural resource conflicts tend to fall through the cracks of the international system. For a series of reasons, largely the siloed structuring of the international system, the technical agencies on one hand, the political side of the international system on the other. For the technical side, resource conflicts tend to be too politically sensitive. For the political side, resource conflicts tend to be too technically complex. The result is they're falling through the cracks in the system and not getting the kind of attention that they need. Third, there's a clear recognition in the United Nations that mediation and related approaches are very suited to natural resource conflicts. For a series of reasons, but in part, as a dispute management or resolution technique, it's very suited to complex conflicts, very flexible rules of evidence, very flexible abilities to deal with information that's scientific, economic, engineering in nature. But also, by its nature, mediation has the parties themselves crafting the solution. The mediator has in her or his hands tools that focus on relationships, so it's suited to the very political sensitivity of resource disputes. Yet even with that recognized, the UN was acutely aware that mediation was being underutilized by the international system in regards to natural resource disputes. And again, the guide was therefore put together to fill that gap and to encourage and put information in the hands of people to promote a greater use of mediation in these settings. Before I overview it, I'm just going to give now a couple of general comments about the guide and the way it's focused and some of the key sort of dimensions around it. Firstly, it focuses on 3 resource sectors: extractives, land, and water. And extractives, it's mostly mining, oil, and gas. Secondly, it's very important that it targets complex political environments. And by that, it's really situations where the resource dimension is closely tied to violence, the risk of violence, or political instability. And those are the kind of contexts that are most important for the UN system when it comes to sort of big-scale conflict. Also, although the guide is explicitly about mediation, it's on the title, it's structured around the mediation process, it's important to note that many of the approaches, many of the techniques that fill the guidebook are just as much about preventing conflict. They're just as much about constructive dialogue and building dialogue and relations around resources across divides of difference, and issues around stakeholder engagement. So although the title is mediation, anyone who knows this field and digs in realizes it's a breadth of tools that have a broad application. In terms of target audience, it was explicitly designed to target mediators, heavily thinking of the mediators at the UN system at the highest levels, but we also designed it so it would be useful for another important and broader category of users. First, actors within the international system, whether we're talking people who work the resource and environment brief, the political side of the equation, or those who are the growing numbers dealing with mediation itself. Secondly, member states of the United Nations, the important disputes they're looking at, so they have access to see where mediation fits in, to consider its relevance. And within those states, typically the government agencies responsible for resource issues, mining ministries, land ministries, etc., and justice ministries. It's also targeting and should be useful for communities that are in disputes. It gives them a chance to look, consider, understand what mediation and related approaches are, and to assess the options as they face and live in their conflicts. And it's also for people who are representing parties in a dispute, negotiating on their behalf or representing them. I'm now going to just give you a sense of what's in there. There are copies available. It should be available for anyone who wants a copy. There are a number at the door, and I believe still are. It's also easily available. You can download it easily online. First chapter introduces key concepts around natural resources, natural resource conflicts and some of their unique characteristics as compared to other kinds of disputes, and then some basic principles and concepts around mediation, those that are most pertinent to the kinds of disputes we're talking about. Secondly, the chapter 2 goes through the mediation process, a sort of 4-phase process. That's the phase that's the structure, the framework that the United Nations system uses for mediation: assessing a problem, designing the engagement or the mediation/negotiation. The third phase is the negotiation and mediation itself. And then the fourth phase is implementation. It goes through those phases in regards to each of the resource sectors. Summarizes by phase, lessons learned, key approaches, techniques, etc. Chapter 3 then goes sector by sector. There's a section on extractives, a section on land, a section on water. In each of those, it talks about the kind of conflict factors that are at play, the things that trigger, drive, influence conflict. And then for each of those sectors, it summarizes a series of good practices, lessons learned, tips, strategies, models that you can follow. And it also includes a series of kind of key questions, a kind of cheat sheet to get in quickly to figure out by sector some of the key issues you need to be thinking of. The fourth chapter looks at resources and conflict from a slightly different perspective. It's not necessarily about the individual or standalone resource dispute, but about the broader context of peace negotiations, where the UN and other international actors involved in bringing parties who've been involved in a civil war, civil conflict dynamic together, a peace negotiation context, so it's the mediation of a peace negotiation, and where do natural resources and land issues fit into the broader framework of peace negotiations. We've seen that over the last 10 years, almost every peace agreement that has been brokered deals with land and natural resources issues in some way, and this gives a summary for those working in that domain. It identifies when resource and land issues should be an issue at the mediation table, the negotiation table. It also discusses the factors that tend to work against that, having to be conscious of those, and then it provides a sort of summary of strategies and approaches to be considered. And then the last chapter, the fifth, takes a series of key takeaway messages. I think there are 7 of them, and it kind of, if you want to, sort of nuggets of wisdom that capture some of the important messages through the document. You may notice there are 2 different versions of the guidebook. There's a larger version that I've got here, and there's a shorter version as well. The content is similar, the only difference being the larger version has a series of 9 case studies at the back. It has photos and maps. And I'll just side note, the maps, thanks to McGill's Geographic Information Center, actually, were an important recognition there. Just a few closing comments on the guide. One is, although the focus is weak state situations, states in transition with violence, risk of violence, political instability in the air, anyone who looks at this and reads it and who's familiar with this field will realize many of the approaches, many of the examples, many of the tactics and techniques in the document are relevant to any resource and land conflict and relevant to a much wider category of jurisdictions, and I think very relevant also, some of the very relevant to jurisdictions such as Canada. And then the last point I'm going to end on is, while we are actively in the UN system encouraging a much more robust and strategic use of mediation and related approaches to resource disputes, like all tools, they have a place where they need to be used, but every tool has its limitations, and it's important to be very conscious that mediation has places for its use. But we also have to be cautious as we see an expanded use of mediation to ensure that it isn't misused or abused in contexts that are inappropriate or not suited to it as a tool. I'll end there, and I'll be chatting a little bit later, providing some examples from the field where we've been applying some of this stuff. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. Louise, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Oh, and I have your book here.
Thank
you very much. So, good evening, everybody. When asked by Michael Brown to join this exciting evening event a couple of months ago, I arranged to read the new Natural Resource and Conflict Guide for Mediators. And I was curious and anxious to get an overview of the international law and normative frameworks in the field of national resources. And we all know that UN mediators work within the framework of the Charter of the United Nations and relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, as well as, I would say, Secretary General bulletins. And these normative tools give legitimacy to the process of mediation. What amazed me, though, is to realize that in the specific field of natural resources conflict, whatever it is called, protection of water, of land, management and control of extractive resources, possession of land, there is a common ground between international and national mediation, what we call un territoire commun. And we do apply the same mediation techniques, and we do prepare our files, I would say, almost in the same manner. The beauty of this guide is that it provides us, mediator, with a critical tool for creating, managing, and leveraging knowledge at the national and international level. And I shared this thought with Michael last month through a vivid experience on environmental mediation that I conducted on March 2015. And we both realized that the four-phase framework reflecting the UN's mediation practices is entirely applicable in national environmental mediation. So I'll give you a quick background of this case. You know that mediation is entirely confidential. It's a confidential process. It's the core of mediation. So I'm allowed to disclose the general details of this mediation, but of course I will not disclose any information that was disclosed to me during caucus. In 2013, the Quebec government announced that it would invest $350 million in a $1.1 billion cement works project called Mécanis. The cement plant, located on the bay of the Atlantic Ocean, would initially produce 2.2 million metric tons of cement annually. Environmental groups and citizens groups slammed the Quebec government for green-lighting the project without any environmental review. And of course, the corporate reputation of Mécanis was at stake as well. On the one hand, citizens and two powerful and credible environmental groups says, this plant will release 1.7 million tons of greenhouse gases per year. That greenhouse gas output would make it the #1 industrial polluter in Quebec. And they added, we know it's extremely polluting because of the materials they will use, but we don't have all the facts, we don't have all the information, so citizens cannot make an informed decision on this issue. On the other hand, Mécanis said its plan will become a model in North America for its environmental performance. It will reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by replacing production of older, less efficient cement plants. Mécanis said the plant will create 400 to 600 jobs in a region plagued by chronic unemployment. I come from Gaspésie, and Port Daniel is in Gaspésie. The jobless rate in Gaspésie was 16.4% in 2014, more than twice the provincial average of 7.7% at the time. For the government, it was an economic dossier and an environmental dossier. So what happened? Court proceedings were instituted by the environmental groups to challenge the authorization certificate issued to Mécanis for the construction of the plant. In February, the environmental groups agreed to withdraw from legal action against Mécanis in exchange for a mediation on the formation of an environmental monitoring committee. First, they negotiated and drafted a first agreement, I called it a preliminary agreement, to mediation. And then, according to this agreement, the mediation will follow. In this first agreement, parties set out the context of the dispute and acknowledges the concerns of the party. They set out the terms and objectives of the mediation to come. There were three main issues to be mediated: the need to monitor the greenhouse gas emissions of the proposed cement plant, the need to monitor the plant's compliance with the American norm called NESHAP, National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutant, and the need to monitor the plant's compliance with the protocol established by the Department of Oceans and Fisheries concerning the protection of marine animals, namely whales and lobster. And you know the latter represents an important part of the local economy. This agreement to mediation had a clear goal: establishing the rules and modalities of the negotiation that would lead to a framework agreement on the formation of a long-term monitoring committee. In other words, it provides the form for the negotiation that would lead to the substance of a final agreement. It establishes the basic of the mediation, the name of the mediator, the subject that will form the substance of mediation, and of course, detail the mandate of the mediator. You see this first step. The agreement in this first step, it represents exactly what we call assessment phase or phase 1 in your guide, in the UN Natural Guide Resources. Exactly the same thing. And I have this guide with me, and it says how the mediation process needs to be designed to maximize the chances of success, as well as the individual profile of a potential mediator, the issues in contention, the parties, their interest, the potential entry points to start the mediation, and design the process. That's exactly what we did in this first step, which is preparedness of the mediation, the phase 1. And then phase 1 is certainly the most important one. You know why? If we cannot get an agreement of the framework of the mediation, forget about it, it's done. So let's examine now the second step, the pre-negotiation or pre-mediation, the real preparedness phase. This second step lays the foundation of mediation. In the mechanism mediation, I choose to meet separately with each of the parties prior to the opening of the mediation. They were long meetings. First, I met with mechanism representatives and then with the environmental groups and citizens group representative. Those meetings served essentially to define the real goal of the mediation. There are always, some interests and motives hidden behind the visible objectives. Always, in all mediation, there's a hidden conflict behind the real conflict. The mediator has to be able to decipher these things. So it gives me precious information. For example, it helps me determine who will be the spokesperson during the mediation. Who are the reluctant ones, the enthusiastic, those to be convinced, those who know the best about the substantive issues. Then it's chance to test some ideas, because I examined the file carefully and I had some ideas. So I had to check if these ideas are valuable and some options that will be eventually developed in the course of mediation. What method I will use during this mediation. More important, pre-mediation meeting help mediator to determine with precision the scope of the mediation. In this guide, phase 2 is called pre-mediation or pre-negotiation. Preparedness, and I quote, "It's exactly what I did. Conduct joint information gathering. Natural resources conflicts are often driven by confused, conflicting, or inconsistent information held by the parties." And then it goes on. And that's exactly what we did. I think okay. And developed a common information base and so on. It was exactly the same thing. So natural resources at the national level or at the international level, of course the actors are not the same, but the process looks like exactly the same. And then the mediation. The mechanism mediation lasted 5 full days. When I say full days, there were full days, let me tell you. After my own opening statement, the parties made their opening statement. Then I conducted a long joint session, all parties in presence. And you know what happened? I asked experts to be heard and to exchange information on the main issues. Cement is manufactured through a closely controlled chemical combination of calcium, silicon, iron, and other ingredients. Researchers are trying to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and also to use less and less energy by finding alternatives to limestone. Limestone is 30% of all the emission. A dry manufacturing process will much lower water consumption, and this will be used too. A geologist explained the new manufacturing process with several steps in gas filtration and cleanup. And then an expert in biomass, which is biological material derived from living organisms like granules de bois, was heard on behalf of the environmental groups. We then conducted an information gathering, the guide, page 22, exactly that. With this presentation, we developed the common information base in accordance with the guide. And this proved to be very useful during the course of the mediation. After we identify potential elements of agreements, consider trade-offs that may require to overcome outstanding issues. As usual, it's like that in all mediation. And at this stage, parties work in separate meetings called caucus. The mediator will work with each party, do the reality check, and I did, and keep the process flowing. After 5 days of negotiation, in the guide, this says the different types of mediator. They are the holistic mediator, they are the, tell me? Yeah. I was a holistic, nice, sweet during 4 days, but I was an authoritarian during the last one. Yeah, okay. And the framework agreement begins by stating that the purpose of committees is to provide the parties with a forum for information exchange and communication regarding the mechanism and plans. To this effect, the committee's mandate is to monitor this environmental commitment regarding the plant's greenhouse gas emission, and so on and so forth. In order to facilitate the committee in carrying out this mandate, the framework agreement provides a structure a composition of committee with mechanist, cement representative, environmental group, local government, civil society, and they even accepted 2 citizens living in the territory of the cement plant to join the committee. The agreement sets out Mechanist's obligation toward the committee to disclose all information relevant to its mandate. Was very important. This agreement provides functional rules for the committee. It specified that the committee is consultative, and they name an independent facilitator to help them conduct the meeting. They have a every month meeting. All the representatives are allowed to enter into the plant in order to check and verify. And finally, what they did, they appointed the retired judge from the Superior Court to act as a mediator if there's any conflict regarding the exchange of information. So far, this agreement has been qualified as an historical agreement that will pave the way for a better monitoring in the industry. Mechanist has allowed an environmental watchdog to enter into its plant and has committed to work very closely with this representative of citizen group and of environmental groups. So what about implementation? It's just 6 months ago. We will see. Usually it takes a good 2 years to make a good assessment of a project like that. So we will see. Maybe we can do another meeting next year and we'll have more result. But it was a fabulous experience. And when I read this guide, I says, well, we have all in common. And thank you very much, because the tools that in this 4-phase mediation system are exactly what we need here at the national level. Thank you, Michael.
Great. Thank you very much, Louise. And just before I move on to the other speaker, Louise mentioned that there is this common ground between the international guide and the national setting in Canada. And I should probably have some full disclosure. If you actually look at the authors and the other contributors of the guide, of the 30 people or 40 people that contributed, about 10 were Canadians. So there's probably no coincidence that there is this interconnection between what the national and the national. Definitely there's a huge amount of Canadian expertise in the guide and Canadian cases. And so very much that really shaped the framework we developed. 2 points you made that I just want to highlight as new to the guide. We didn't talk about these in the guide, but I think they're worth highlighting. One, there's always a hidden conflict behind the conflict, and that's definitely something we do see. Find the hidden conflict below the expression of conflict and really be patient to understand what that hidden conflict is. And the second you pointed out is the importance of mediation during implementation. And oftentimes, during the implementation of a mediated agreement, you still need mediation support. And I think that's a really valuable lesson to point out. So thank you very much for that. Next up on the agenda is Jeffrey Davidson. So the floor is yours, Jeffrey, please. Thank you very much.
Did you borrow this from my library? By the way, I'm a McGill graduate as well. That's so that you'll keep the questions humane and tender, right, when they come. When we talk about mineral resource development, this involves the search for, identification, evaluation, and development of targeted non-renewable deposits of fuel and non-fuel minerals. These concentrated deposits of minerals have fixed locations, are of variable quality and quantity, and pose a variety of extractive challenges that are a function of their physical deposition, their mineralogical and structural characteristics, their geographical locations, and the demand for specific commodities and end-user products of which they are a part. Today, the search for these deposits, or for those types of deposits that can be extracted profitably or economically, has spread globally into areas that are increasingly remote, not easily accessible, with limited infrastructure or governance, in biophysical environments with fragile ecosystems and vulnerable human populations whose survival is often linked materially and spiritually to these places and ecosystems. Whether it's Canada's far north, tropical Amazonia, or the dry, high-altitude plateaus and mountain areas of the altiplanos of Latin America, and that's just on this side of the planet without talking about the other side, right? Well, these minerals enable us to enjoy our post-industrial ways of life. The search for extraction and sale of these minerals also generate new economic and developmental opportunities for those people under whose land the minerals are found, but also the potential for major disturbances, dislocations, and adverse impacts on the communities and regions that will be affected by extractive activities. Ironically, the very opportunities and risks to host countries and communities posed by their own mineral endowments and the ensuing extractive activities also create the potential for conflict at local, national, and even regional levels. Many of the factors and conditions which singly or in combination can give rise to conflict are well described in your publication. I don't have a copy here to raise up like Louise did, right? During a recent visit to Peru, a country which has become increasingly dependent for its economic survival on the extraction of primary resources, social conflict around resource development, and not just mining, has increased to a point where conflicts now are publicly tracked and reported. And 4 government ministries, mining and energy, environment, culture, and agriculture, including the Water Authority, each have their own conflict resolution units, with the Prime Minister's office promoting a coordinated approach to reducing the risk of conflict and to resolving conflict when it occurs. Dialogue tables have become a major means for bridging concerns and creating space for agreement making, with formal mediation having a lesser role, but this may even be changing. I'd like to share a few observations. Conflict around oil, gas, and mining activities may be project-specific, but have national governance implications. There are situations, some of which have been highlighted in the guidebook, where the potential for intercommunal or political conflict already exists, and the intrusion of extractive enterprises can serve as the lightning rod that ignites the conflict in full form. So, for example, the Bougainville copper mine in Papua New Guinea and the oil fields of Aceh in Indonesia were not in and of themselves the cause of conflict between the regions and the central government, but the mine and the oil fields introduced a new dimension, an element to a pre-existing conflict, and became part of a larger problem. Conflict, the final point, conflict must not be accepted as an intrinsic natural outcome of extractive activity. how prospectors and developers approach, engage, and work with the communities and governments affected by their activities has a lot to do with minimizing conflict risks and contributing to community sustainability. How well communities are prepared to deal with such activities, their potential impacts on their livelihoods and ways of life, and the nature and extent of their prior experience with extractive activities also have something to do with the way the experience unfolds. How prepared and effective local and national governments are to regulate and manage extractive activities to ensure that benefits to both the country and the affected communities are greater than the costs is another issue or aspect. And then there is the role of the international institutions and home governments and what role they can assume to help reduce the risks of conflict, especially in fragile and conflict-prone states. In the case of Canada, this is what the government's extractive sector corporate social responsibility strategy for Canadian companies operating abroad is all about. Defining ways in which the government of Canada can promote responsible business practice and the continuous improvement of social and environmental performance on the ground. In other words, doing business the Canadian way. The strategy also defines ways of intervention, the ways in which the government can intervene appropriately to reduce the risk of conflict, and how the government can proceed and hold Canadian oil, gas, and mining companies accountable when they act irresponsibly. The Office of the Counselor, which is what I'm part of, as a piece of the strategy, had its mandate refocused last November when the government issued an updated version of the strategy. And the Office of the Counselor is no longer to be reactive to situations already spiraling out of control, but to be proactive, to work at the front end of extractive activity, to promote and support responsible policies and practices, to clarify government expectations, and to concentrate on early detection of potential problem situations and intervene early enough and in ways that would diminish the risk of conflict escalation. It is the Government of Canada's belief that early detection and appropriate interventions will serve to, quote, alleviate polarization on issues, avoid unnecessary hostility or emotional damage between the parties, and prevent conflict escalation, to use the language of the guide. Early intervention may be initiated by the office itself or be a response to a request for help from an individual, a community group, or a company itself. This may lead to dialogue facilitation or even mediation if deemed appropriate and if requested by both parties to a dispute. So if I ever get to this point of mediation in a formalized way, there is some good stuff in the guidebook relating to the rigor and discipline that supports an effective mediation process, that highlights those unique aspects of mediating natural resource conflicts and some of the particular challenges that complicate mediation efforts, including asymmetrical power relationships between the actors, the marginalization of already vulnerable groups, a weak or absent government, and the challenge of defining who needs to be at the table and making sure that their voices are heard and their concerns are articulated and taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Before we go to the floor for a couple of questions, just two ideas that you highlighted that are new to the guide, which I really, really liked. One is the understanding that resource conflicts typically interact with other pre-existing conflicts. They aren't necessarily standalone. They compound pre-existing problems and tensions. So when you're mediating these, you have to understand that they often augment or exacerbate existing conflicts. And the other idea is that there's often multiple levels of conflict, from the local level to the national level to the transboundary level. And so it is really difficult to understand the whole conflict landscape, which is a great point. And the other point is just, if you just think about what you said about, natural resources in fragile states have so many interesting dimensions. They have physical characteristics, their geographic location is important, their economic value is important and constantly shifting, their cultural value is important, they're in situations of weak rule of law with vulnerable groups. I mean, this is why these are so complex to actually address. There's so many dimensions, and this is why an interdisciplinary approach is so important. So thank you very much for pointing that out. So now to the floor for a couple of questions to either of our first two panelists. We have two microphones coming around the room, so if you have a question, please keep it short, laser sharp, and let's have two or three. If we have hands up, who has a question?
I'll try and make it laser sharp.
Laser sharp.
And humane. It's primarily intended for Professor Davidson. I see in Figure 3 that revenue management is considered a potential conflict trigger. So my question is about revenue transparency. I think this relates to the importance of information gathering and, as you mentioned, asymmetrical power dynamics. Do you think that revenue transparency is essential or important for effective mediation in this context? And specifically, I'm curious about Canada's position on revenue transparency. I know that there is new legislation mandating transparency, but that there's also an exceptions clause provision that allows, the regulations are forthcoming. I'm not really sure about the motivation behind the exceptions provision, and do you consider it a potential threat to effective dispute resolution in the extractive industry? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take two more and then we'll go to answers. Any other key laser sharp questions? We have one in the front, then we have one in the back, and then we'll close it on that.
Thanks. You spoke.
Sorry, John. Who's it to? Who's it to? Both panelists, or
sorry, to Jeffrey, but also perhaps to both. You spoke briefly of the asymmetry in terms of the mediation process, and it would seem that often that's the norm, where you have a very high capacity extractive industry or company, and on the other hand, you have a much more limited capacity on the part of local communities and even government. So given how common that is, how prevalent that is, I'm wondering, from your angle, how do you view that being resolved? Certainly that favors the extractive company going into that arrangement, and we've seen the results of advantage and disadvantage coming out. So I wondered if we could just give it a technical spin, perhaps from someone who's actually been in sort of the mediation as well. Maybe sort of speak to the asymmetry part.
Great, thank you. And then one final question in the back. There was one hand up. Thank you.
Thank you. I was just wondering what's your opinion about investor-state mediation, which is very often concerned with natural resources, and I'm especially interested in like the problem that the fundamental nature of both parties or all the parties is very different. So what do you think about the future, the challenges of especially investor-state mediation?
Sorry, is that interstate, state-to-state mediation?
No, investor-state.
Investor.
Yeah.
Can you clarify just a little bit more what you mean by that?
Well, when there is this dispute between investor and a state which is regulating the field or the special business of an investor.
Okay.
Sometimes covered by an agreement, like investor-state agreement.
Okay, thank you very much.
Well, two are for me.
If we could start with Jeffrey, and then we'll move to.
What's the question? I didn't
there were
get it.
There were three questions.
Okay, but
The second one was more for you.
What is
which,
it?
Which
I
was
didn't
about
get
dealing
it.
with asymmetry.
Huh?
Asymmetry between the different groups. How do you deal with asymmetry in the context of a mediation? Jeffrey, do you want to start?
Okay, so revenue transparency is one of the complicating elements in terms of the development potential for the extractive sector. And there's been a lot of work done on this at the international level, including the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. But there was also a sense that home countries had to take a role and responsibility to move this forward as well. And over the past 4 or 5 years, there have been a number of national initiatives, including the Dodd-Frank National Fiscal Financial Reform Bill in the United States, which one of the final or last amended clauses of which addresses revenue transparency. But interestingly enough, the Security and Exchange Commission has been struggling to create an acceptable set and workable set of regulations for reporting to this day. So 5 years later, it's still not resolved. A number of European countries have established regulations and expectations in terms of revenue reporting, as has Canada. Now, in terms of the Canadian situation, it is important to note that this was the result of a multi-stakeholder process that involved the mining industry, the government, and key non-government organizations, including Publish What You Pay. And they came up with a solution that they felt they could fly with and that could work effectively. The other side of the coin in terms of revenue transparency is it's great to report the revenues that you make available or that you deposit in government bank accounts, but the other side of the coin is how the money is actually used and expended. Is it allocated for development? Is it used in wasteful ways? In terms of capacity, at the other side of the table, the capacity issue of communities and power asymmetries, this is a major issue. When I worked in southern Venezuela at a mining property, it was clearly an issue that we needed to address. If we wanted to have an effective partnership and engage and involve the community constructively in the project, they had to have the capacity to understand and to speak their minds and to feel comfortable across the table from us. So, over time, everything that we did with the community involved an element of capacity building. Whether it was creating a mining area that the community-based miners could manage for themselves and for the benefit of their communities, we had to help them learn how to keep books, how to negotiate with traders and outsiders, and how to negotiate with us. Because we entered into a partnership with them, and roles and responsibilities had to be clearly understood and defined. And if the skills and the competencies weren't there amongst the community people, then we had to help them or find ways of enabling them to develop those competencies.
Thank you. Louise, did you want to share some thoughts on?
Just about, as a practitioner, because I'm a mediator, so let's just think about the symmetry when I'm presiding a mediation in the mediation room. The mediator will have to balance the power in the mediation room, and he or she will have to do that without compromising her or his neutrality. It's very difficult. It's for experienced mediators, because you never want to be looked at partial, but you have to help. How do you do that? When I have a vulnerable group compared to the opponent, I will conduct more caucuses and less joint session, because your vulnerability appears clearly when you're in joint sessions. But when you caucus, it gives the mediator much more leverage in order to address this problem. Second, at this level of natural resources, vulnerable groups are less vulnerable than they used to be. Don't forget the power of media and the power of social network. Having a bad reputation for a corporation is not a very good thing. It's bad business these days. They don't like it. In the past, they didn't care about that. But now they care about that. So I see that environment groups, they can easily reach the media. They can easily get their assistance somewhere, and they can reach social network, and it can damage the reputation of the business. So that's why I think that these days, what we used to know as asymmetry is getting less and less symmetry. Plus, you have a new, if I'm allowed to tell that, it's a new phenomenon now in media. I was in Baltimore 3 weeks ago when I discussed that with the International Academy of Mediators. They're all mediators from around the world. I said, have you noticed that, guys? Something's happening in our mediation room. I don't know if it's the same for you than for us, but I realized that when a group is more vulnerable, very often we get an agreement on the principle, and then instead of signing it, they will come back with a major demand at the end of the process. I'm talking about vulnerable groups. It's a new trend for unions, for environmental groups. You did the whole negotiation, you have an agreement on principle, so I just forget, I need 2 million. God, you didn't tell me that during the preparation. No. And I noticed that, for example, when I did big mediation at the Canadian level with big unions, that's the way they did. So it's a new, and when we know about it, it's nice. It's a new trend. I agree with that. But we'd like to know. Mediator, we'd like to be trusted by our group. So we'd like to know. But if it's the way it works, and we will cope with it. But that's the way to say to you that maybe it's more different in emerging countries. I don't know. But is it the same thing? But I think the power and the assistance of media in social network is getting more and more evident.
Thank you very much. On that note, we'll return to the final two panelists. The next presentation and remarks will be from François Crépeau.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'll be talking about migration and how it relates to mediation. Migration is one of the results of festering disputes and conflicts. One has to understand what migration is and analyze why it happens if one is to understand what the dispute is about. Migration is a normal response to stress. political stress, economic, social, environmental stress. Migration is actually the normal state of humankind. We all come from one woman in Eastern Africa approximately 200,000 years ago, and we've conquered the planet several times over. We are a migrating species. We have always migrated, even after we've settled in agricultural communities, and even today, we're constantly moving for work, for holidays, for pilgrimage, for studies, for retirement, for protection, or just for the sake of it. Migration is always an individual choice, although some migration waves can amount to hundreds of thousands of people moving together. Migration is an individual journey in various social spaces. In the same family, responding to the same stress factors, some will migrate, others won't. Forced migration happens when people see no other viable choice than to change place. Natural disasters, violence, and poverty are the main drivers of forced migration because of the loss of means of livelihood. Migration often happens when individuals are not considered as valid interlocutors in the discussions to resolve the dispute and are not included in the conflict resolution mechanisms. Too often, migration is considered a transitory state, and governments will consider migrants as collateral damage, not as central actors of the conflict and of its resolution. Yet, we have examples of migration creating conflicts all over the planet, from Eastern Europe to the Middle East, to Central Asia, to South and Southeast Asia, to Latin America. Most of those conflicts or disputes have natural resources aspects, be it water or oil or forest or rare minerals or land. People living under stress may become migrants. They will think of migration as one option, not the easiest, but maybe the one with the most prospects. In that sense, migration may be an early sign of a festering dispute. Paying attention to migration movements and listening to the voice of migrants about the causes of their migration may serve as an early warning mechanism of disputes which may develop into more violent conflicts. The guide contains multiple examples of disputes and conflicts where migrants were involved, whether this is mentioned or not. Refugees will flee violence to protect themselves and their families. In the course of my mandate, I've been able to interview many refugees and many migrants, and deprivation, including discriminatory non-access to scarce resources, such as water or land, is so often at the source of their flight. People will migrate when pushed out by development projects, such as major dams and industrial complexes that are depleting the water table, or they will be forcibly displaced by private actors, such as transnational companies, in particular in the extraction sector. Migrants moving to other communities may create additional stress for local communities. For example, we often see refugees moving to a community and cutting wood in order to build houses and cook when wood is already a rare resource a scarce resource in the region. Migrants returning home after some period of time may also create stress. For example, when the land has been redistributed in the meantime, or the houses have been appropriated by others, and the land tenure system is not robust enough to handle competing claims. We've seen this in Bosnia, in Cambodia, and Timor. We have numerous examples of migrant families keeping as a treasure the keys of the house they had to abandon. And the guide mentions land tenure as one key aspect for resource mediation. Migrants and refugees are often not included in peacemaking processes, as they are often considered outsiders, either because they have left the country or the region and are considered not to have a stake anymore in the issues, or because they have too recently arrived to be considered as permanent stakeholders. Including migrants, refugees, returnees, and diasporas in any type of peace negotiations or mediation processes is often one key of the numerous keys to success. If dignity is defined as the ability to exercise options in choosing the course of one's life, migration is always a dignity-seeking journey. Migrants may often be victims of human rights violations or economic deprivation, but they are not only victims. They are survivors. They are constantly making decisions that will determine the course of their lives and that of their children. They exercise agency on a daily basis. Mediation is about putting all stakeholders together, about engaging all actors as valid interlocutors in all the processes necessary to sustainably resolve the disputes or conflicts, in recognizing that their dignity needs as much respect as that of any other stakeholder. Inclusivity is mentioned in the guide as one of the key features of mediation, including the most marginalized communities, including migrants and refugees in particular, despite social and political asymmetries, is often the only way to achieve lasting resolution of conflicts and disputes. Migrants are human beings with dignity and human rights, wherever they are, like any one of us. They exercise the ultimate agency offered to human beings moving to hopefully greener pastures. Mediation offers them the possibility to have their voice heard and take part in whatever process is put in place to resolve the dispute. Their dignity requires no less, and our collective dignity depends on this essential recognition. I'm very impressed with this detailed and richly illustrated guide and hope that the methodology it outlines will be used to allow migrants and refugees to speak up and play their important part in the resolution of disputes and conflicts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francois. Michael, I think we'll turn the floor over to you for the final presentation.
Earlier, I gave you kind of a walkthrough of the guide. Now, I'm going to give you a few examples from the field. I've been doing this across a lot of countries, a lot of regions, across the spectrum, land, water, extractives conflicts. And I thought that today I'll walk you through 3 examples from the field. I've decided to take recent ones, places that I've been in the last 2 years, in and out on missions called in to deal with the conflict dynamic. And I'm just going to go through them one at a time. In each one, I'm going to give you a sense of some context, an idea of the sort of engagement that was involved, and extract a lesson learned or an observation out of it. And I'm just going to go through them, starting and one at a time, and trying to get a sort of a variety as well of picking from what I've been doing over the last 2 years, a little variety in terms of resource sector and region. First, transboundary or cross-border water conflicts in Central Asia, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. Context, briefly, very complicated borderlines through and around areas of ethnic identity. Water, a very limited resource, aridity, unsustainable agricultural practices, and a poorly maintained water infrastructure, dams, canals, that was inherited from the Soviet era. Ongoing tension and conflict is related to water issues is very prevalent at the local level in the cross-border areas. And at the same time, at the central level, very limited engagement between the states around the issues of water tension. So I was called in, went, and I think each of these examples are from when I was the UN senior mediation expert on resources and land conflicts with the Department of Political Affairs. The engagement, first, there was a decision in the UN to engage and to use the local level of the conflict dynamic as an entry point. We've already mentioned that resource conflicts tend to operate and be expressed at a multiplicity of levels: local, sort of provincial, departmental, state, and often internationally. So the decision was to use the local level as the entry point, given that the central government level between the countries was largely closed. At the local level, I worked with women's organizations on both sides of the border, brought them together. We used mediation approaches to bring them together, to help them analyze the conflict dynamic, analyze their options, and as a result of that, we help them make decisions jointly. Long story short, the process turned into a joint planning process in which they put together a collaborative framework at the local level for water management. At the central level, we then used the entry point that we had, working within the UN system, to help design a binational strategy between the two UN country offices that is now going to start playing itself out to support the central level governments. There exists a joint water commission that has been relatively unused. So we use the dynamic at the local level to then work towards generating some momentum at the central level to then support the same dialogue around the water conflict through central level mechanisms. A few lessons or observations on this. One, although we often talk about natural resources and its risk for conflict, I thought this was interesting because it's an example where natural resources offer us the potential for collaboration and peace building across issues of divide. Secondly, I think it's an interesting example because, as I said, most natural resource disputes tend to operate at a multiplicity of levels, and the strategic use of those different levels to find entry points, but also the importance that when you're looking at resource conflicts, one has to be very conscious of those different levels and what are the potential linkages or what are the essential linkages between the different levels when you're thinking through a strategy, an engagement strategy. And then third, it's an example of working actively with women. Not only because they're important resource users, but also because of the collaborative potential offered when working with women around resource conflicts. Secondly, another example, hydroelectric and mining conflicts, Guatemala. Context. We see natural resources at this point in time, anyone knows the dynamic, is that are very closely associated with high degrees of conflictivity, or la conflictividad social, as it is called in Guatemala, violence, human rights violations, and political instability. In the context, there had been community leaders and security forces that had both been killed around hydro and mining sites before I was called down. Just a few weeks before I was down, the president had declared a state of national emergency and called in the army to one of the sites. Also, it's important to reflect upon the structural and systemic problems, a part of the context here. The structural and systemic problems of extremely weak governance, limited rule of law, and a series of unresolved land issues that go back in time and corruption. This is all sort of the context. Important to note as well, what I mentioned a little earlier, is we're talking about a situation, 35 years of civil war, the peace process was in the mid-1990s, and the peace agreements, very robust, addressed natural resources and land issues. So it's an example also in the context of, there's a series of so I guess I'll leave that as the context. In terms of the engagement, the request was to use mediation to resolve these disputes. Involved extensive engagement with a wide range of actors, community groups, government actors, the church, companies involved. In terms of also my engagement, very early in my time there, I had to clarify that mediation isn't a tool that's going to solve structural or systemic problems at the level of individual projects. So I had to kind of talk through the reality of what are the tools and where are they able to be used. That said, there were other tools that can be useful. They don't necessarily solve the dispute, but they can be very useful in terms of improving things. And we're talking tools related to greater transparency, better communication, more respectful spaces of dialogue, building greater capacity for the people to talk, the different parties to be able to talk, better communication, and to talk and engage constructively, and building the ability to negotiate to see more options for engagement other than the quickly resorting to violence. Concretely, we set up a series of dialogues around one of the particular disputes that was being looked at. It involved the local archbishop, and it involved the president. The local archbishop was essential because that was what brought legitimacy to the process. The president, in the context, wouldn't have alone, but the archbishop was able to bring that and get people to the table. But at the same time, I had to be very clear that ultimately there's a need to address the structural and systemic issues around natural resources and land at the national level. Now, that said, I'm not suggesting in naivete that that was necessarily going to be addressed very quickly given the political context. Lessons or observations out of this. One, mediation per se is not always the perfect tool, but a wide range of related mediation approaches can still be very effective in reducing violence and saving lives and bringing people together around something that is causing conflict and tension. Also a reflection on natural resources in the conflict in the context of peace agreements. We are, and I mentioned earlier, we're at a stage where resources and land are getting into almost all of the major peace agreements right now. But we have to now focus our attention on how do we ensure implementation of these commitments. Because in many ways, this is an example of unimplemented peace commitments. A lot of the issues in the mid-90s that were established in the peace agreements were not implemented. And as a result, we're seeing right now the wide range of social conflictivity around a range of disputes that even include micro-hydro projects. And it's because of never having addressed some of the structural or systemic issues. Changing gears to the third, post-conflict land disputes, Sri Lanka. Also, very similar work on this in East Timor a little bit earlier. Context, a series of post-conflict provinces with thousands of land disputes. Very complex political environment with a challenging set of relations between the government and the United Nations. I'm not going to go into that in this space, but a very challenging sort of dynamic around human rights and other issues. But I was asked to develop a land dispute mediation system for the post-conflict provinces to deal with those thousands of land disputes. The engagement, I went in through, I think, 3 different missions. First, we had to assess the situation and develop a clear understanding of the types of land disputes. What are the types of land disputes? What are their numbers? What's the scale of the problem that has to be addressed? Second key issue in assessing the situation is to understand what are the capacities to deal with conflict? What are the capacities to deal with mediation and conflict resolution? Capacities at the local level, down to the community level, and capacities nationally. Interesting and important to note, it was clear there's a long history and experience of community mediation in the country. What we did is work to design an integrated system for mediating and resolving land disputes. Involves elements of community-based mediation, the use of mediation, sort of more technical mediation, Sri Lankans who come in and work at the level using more traditional, if you will, or I should say, trained mediation approaches to complementing the community mediation, the use of arbitration, and linking things to the courts. By that I'm talking about an integrated system. It dealt with public and private lands as well. I had to link the two. I was involved in helping them draft a bill for Parliament that was jointly submitted, Ministry of Justice and Ministry of Lands, and if I understand correctly, has recently gone into law. And then also helped developing policies and training programs and even training manuals so that the implementation of the integrated system would have the capacities built of all the people who would have to operate that system and understand how it works. And I think it has the potential to resolve probably thousands of individual disputes over the next few years. It will be operating in multiplicity of schools sort of every Saturday morning throughout all of these provinces. Importantly also, we had to design a system that explicitly excluded certain disputes that were not suited to mediation, particularly disputes between certain state actors and large numbers of people, partly because of imbalances of power and partly because of the notion of state versus individual in the framework. A few lessons and observations, or this is an example, I think, of 2 things worth highlighting. First is the designing of an integrated dispute resolution system is a real reflection of where things are going. We're seeing more and more of that right now. In situations where we're looking at numerous disputes that are predictable and that continue coming forward, the notion of trying to deal with individual disputes is not as effective when we can now design systems that can deal with large numbers of disputes. The second is the fundamental importance of building on the capacity that exists in the context and locally. And I mentioned that last point, to anyone in the development field, that's pretty obvious. But to those of us who work in the mediation context that come in the political roles, it's not necessarily the autopilot. So the importance of understanding, and it's not necessarily part of the traditional mediator skill set to actually build the skills of the parties who are in the disputes themselves. So I'll leave it at that and pass it back to David. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to take moderator's prerogative now to extend the session by a couple minutes, perhaps around 15 minutes, so we can continue with our questions, because I know there are some questions. So we'll start with a couple questions to the last two panelists, and then we'll open it up to all four. So the microphone, the first question is on the front. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I have a question for Michael. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how young people and legal practitioners would be able to get more involved in environmental mediation within Canada, and not necessarily in the international framework, but subnationally, possibly with Aboriginal people related to natural resource issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was a question up front.
So this weekend we'll begin in Paris the 21st Conference of the Parties, and the major subject will be, the major objective will be to reach an agreement on CO2 emission reduction. And I think we can agree to say that climate change will just increase the number of conflicts linked with natural resources. So do you think it's a good idea to focus on this subject? Or do you feel that there is some subjects that will be missing in this conference?
Hi, this question is to Professor Brown. So Professor Brown, thank you for this guide. It's absolutely fantastic. And I'm curious though, as you're looking forward, what do you see as the most important steps in making sure that it has effective implementation out there past the edges of this campus?
Okay, I'll stop the questions there. I'll hand the floor to Michael, and then we'll continue with the broader round of questions. Okay, sure. So the first question was about how do law students engage in mediation? Where do we get experience and exposure in Canada?
In terms of, in terms of getting exposure or getting involved, I think that that's a question. I've been having some conversations. I know that Louise teaches a course on mediation in the law faculty. I would shamelessly suggest people consider that course who are in the law school.
All my students are present
tonight. And I think that actually it's a question that I know I'm recently back to Quebec, and it's one of the questions that I'm thinking about an awful lot. I don't have a quick answer, but I think it's a very important question. I'd like to think there are going to be some discussions around that exact issue in the coming weeks and months. I think I'll leave it at that for.
Francois, did you want to tackle the question of climate change and security? If not, I can certainly tackle it. I can tackle that question.
I think you're perfectly suited for that.
Absolutely. We anticipate climate change, obviously, to have a major effect on natural resources, causing more competition over natural resources, and potentially creating more conflict. And we're definitely pushing in the Paris Comp to actually put that on the agenda. We're having two side events looking at climate change and security, and we're at the actual event, we're launching a new partnership with the EU, $5.5 million partnership on climate change and security, trying to help countries identify where the most vulnerable areas are to the security implications of climate change, and then actually working at the community level to try to build up their resilience to risks and shocks from climate change. So it's definitely an issue. It's definitely on our radar screen, and we have a new program in the process of being designed to address it, and we are certainly trying to put it on the agenda.
The implementation question.
One point as a follow-up to what you just said. I think we have to consider the difficulty that governments have in considering migration, internal migration in part, but certainly international migration, as a proper adaptation measure to climate change. They have great difficulty in thinking it through.
I think the last question, the question about implementation, it's a very big one for those of us who've been working on this. And I guess where we're at right now is the guidebook, the UN's been able to put together something that consolidates, like we were talking about, decades of hands-on experience. This launch is part of a series of launches we're doing around the world in a number of places. And what I think, what we can say that's very clear is the response has been incredibly strong. There's a clear message. Yes, you've got it in terms of the content. Yes, this is a fundamentally important issue. Yes, mediation and related approaches have an important contribution in this area. So I know the UN, and David may have some more detailed comments on it, but I mean, the UN is actively wanting to build on the momentum coming out of the guide, and we're looking at ways of institutionalizing in some manner the ability to deliver on the kinds of ideas that are documented in the guide. We're very well aware that there's the need to build capacity around the world in a number of particular regions and in a long list of particular countries. We're very well aware there's a need for a new generation of people who can bridge these areas of expertise that unfortunately, at this point in time, there are not lots of people who can bridge the different areas of expertise and also operate in the challenging sort of international environment of complicated states. We are certainly, sitting here with the McGill hat, we're very happy to have been coordinating with the UN Environment Program, and we'll see if we're able to see some kind of collaborative efforts moving forward from here.
Exactly, and as I said when we started this whole process, that was definitely one of our end goals, was to find an institution that we could potentially partner with going forward. And I do hope that we can continue this dialogue with McGill on creating, as you say, institutionalizing this and providing more systematic mediation support around natural resources. Let's go back to the floor for questions. There's a question on the side. Two.
These are for everyone?
Yeah.
Hello. Oh, shit, that's really loud. Sorry. I have a question for Michael about the kind of natural resources conflicts in Guatemala. Many of those mining conflicts, on the company side, many of these companies are Canadian, like companies like Goldcorp in the Marlin mine conflict and Tahoe Resources in the Escobal mine conflict. And do you think any of this mediation, especially in terms of, let's say, justice for some of the abuses committed by these Canadian companies, should this be happening in Canada?
Take a couple more questions and then we'll go to the end, panelists. Thanks.
With the use of these UN guidelines, I was wondering how, once a body of cases develops where they've been implemented and they've shown to be effective, would you use them then to identify conflicts before they necessarily arise? And whether you have some sort of database that you're building with common features across conflicts so that you can use those as signifiers and kind of get in with mediation at the start.
And one more question. The front row, please.
Question for Professor Krepo. It's for international migration. So there is a tension between the national interest and the migrants. Specifically, do you think it is important to distinguish between temporal migrants and permanent migrants? Again, and how do we distinguish between the duration of the migration? is it, because I see the difference between the terms, like migration and immigration. Like, so for me, it sounds like migrants are more permanent and more temporal, and immigrants are more like permanent, and migrants are more temporal. So do you think it is important to distinguish between two groups?
Thank you. Why don't we start with Michael, and then we'll move to Francois for the responses.
Sure. I guess two of them that jump out. First, the question of natural resource conflicts in Guatemala. I think a couple of points on that. One is mediation has a place. It also isn't the tool for everything, and you don't necessarily mediate human rights violations. For example, you don't mediate illegal acts, for example. But that said, there are a wide range of tools that go in the toolkit that I've tried to talk about that are extremely useful and pertinent in order to improve discussion, dialogue, improve the transparency and access to information, improve the kind of communication that takes place, because it can allow people to sort of cross over differences. And the example I gave quickly in Guatemala, well, I mentioned in that example, although I was called down with sort of the hope that, is mediation a kind of going to solve everything, and I was very clear, no, at the level of individual disputes, where we're talking about structural and systemic problems that are part of the dynamic, mediation isn't going to be your solution, but there was a whole range of tools and approaches that could be helpful. Mediation can have a place at the higher level when countries are at a point where they're in a situation where they can address the broader structural and systemic issues. So again, it has a place, but it isn't necessarily the tool where you're looking at certain kinds of violations that are playing themselves out. The second, data to help prevent conflicts, a resounding absolutely. That is what is very important. It's very needed, and it can be very helpful. I remember a number of years back, I was invited down and worked with the Office of the Presidency in Bolivia to help set up an early warning and early response system in regards to resource conflicts. And for those in the field, the tendency often is to talk about early warning systems where you sort of collect the information and you can see the indicators coming. Not wanting to turn it into a lengthy discussion, but it's really important to get beyond early warning. We need to build systems that have early warning and early response built into them. I will leave it at that, but there may be some issues in those questions that Jeffrey may also want to take a stab at, but I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Michael. Francois?
Yes, I'm not sure where the question was heading, but I have a few elements. Distinction between temporary and permanent migration. Each migration situation is different. It depends on the conflict or the situation in the country that is left, and I'm talking here about international migration. You could add to that internal migration, which is a whole other ballgame. And we've seen very different situations. For example, Kosovo. Thousands of people poured out of Kosovo when Kosovo was in crisis. 5,000 were taken into Canada. More than half of them went back relatively quickly, within a few years. Same thing for the Bosnians that were in Germany. Most of them went back. So not permanent. The conditions that were given to them in Germany were very precarious, and that also helps explain why they went back. Syria, at present, Syria is utterly destroyed. If we think that the Syrians that are out of Syria at the moment and are going to Europe are going to go back to Syria anytime soon, I think we're deluded. So it's something, Europe needs to think about receiving 7 or 8 million Syrians in the coming years. And they're not. So each migration depends. And I think one element that I'd like to stress is the element of early warning. I mentioned that before, but I think when you talk about early warning, I think migrants are a key factor. Listening to migrants, listening to the first migrants who come, they are by themselves an early warning system. And we usually don't take that into account enough, and we're certainly not listening to them because they're always considered outsiders. They're outsiders in the communities they've left because they've left, and they're outsiders in the communities that they've joined because they have too recently joined. And so we're dismissing their experience, and yet they have lots to say about the situations that have been left, and they have lots to say about how they would envisage going back and be part of a resolution of the conflict. So,
thank you very much. And just to add to this, the question of early warning, the work we did with John Unruh, these are 3 of the books. There's actually 6 of them. They total about 150 case studies. They're all about natural resources in post-conflict settings. A lot of this was actually done as the groundwork to come up with better systems of early warning, identification of conflict as far upstream as possible. So that is the goal that we're aiming for. I'll take one more question to the panel, and then I'm going to ask the panelists. We've got a room here full of potential future resource mediators. What's the one piece of wisdom, what's the one piece of advice, something from the guide that you really like, or something from your own experience that you want to drill home to the room? So just be thinking about that, the one really key piece of advice to a room full of future potential mediators. So 1 or 2 more questions from the floor. One question here, and then we'll go to the advice.
Thank you. So I'm taking Professor John Unruh's Geography of Development course, and during the class we learned that international development intervenes in peace-building process and resolves the conflict, but it doesn't last long, and another conflict arises. So how do you ensure that mediation intervention has a long-lasting impact in the community?
So this is, basically the question of implementation as well as long-term conflict prevention and building the capacity to resolve disputes as they go forward. Panelists, I can start with Michael if you want to share some thoughts on that. On the question? Yeah, on the question.
Yes, it's when you have resource disputes, it's particularly in complicated it applies anywhere. But when we're talking the complicated international context of weaker state situations, developing country situations, in many ways, I see the crisis or the conflict that has brought attention to it as an opportunity. And often you're dealing in situations where when you get the chance to get together, things have got to the point that it brings people in to try and help solve the dispute or address the dispute. That's an opportunity to readjust how things are going to go in terms of the forward, go in terms of the future. So in many ways, it's about linking any kind of mediation process or good process that brings people together around a conflict to start setting up the kinds of mechanisms and identify the kinds of priorities that people need in order to address their needs in a longer-term situation. In terms of the mixing of, and that applies whether we're talking sort of localized dispute or higher level. One of the things, I was recently on a panel of, actually the government recently called some of us in who'd been doing mediation in the international domain to reflect on some of our experiences. And one of the key lessons that came out of those of us that had been doing this internationally was that you have to get outside of a kind of traditional mediator thinking where you're just focused on the dispute, because in the international context, the dispute's just usually a symptom of underlying problems, and it's an opportunity to then help people think through longer-term development needs and longer-term planning that is more inclusive, more democratic, and covers a wider spectrum of people who typically involve those who've been left out a long time.
Anybody further want to add to that? If not, then we'll go for the sage advice to the audience. And I won't wrap up after the sage advice, so this will be the wrap up, and then we'll pass the floor back to Phil. So, Michael, do you want to start with your sage advice?
I love that idea. I guess one thing, you asked the question about anyone who is thinking possibly of working in this field. I would underscore one thing. When I've looked back at the years of what I've done for a long time, I've correctly or enormous error in my life always been attracted to the issues that are most complicated and most complex. That applies when I started off in my geography training at McGill University, and it applies when I went into law, and consistently, I've always, in every area, I've been attracted to complicated problems and the complex stuff that typically brings together a multiplicity of disciplines, that's wrapped up into complicated tensions and complicated human relations. So that's a comment that if that doesn't interest you, if it doesn't like you, if your sort of spine goes, ow, I don't want that, it's probably not the right field. But if that stuff attracts you and you always find yourself intellectually and emotionally engaged in those kinds of, in that kind of dynamic, then you probably have a real lot of good latent mediator in you.
Thanks, Michael. Jeffrey?
In terms of my own experience, I think what I would propose to you is that as you go forward, you need to always keep an open mind, that there are no blacks or whites, that the world is made up of gray zones, and that different shades. That's right, different shades of gray. And what seems to be the case may not always be what it appears to be. So you have to dig deeper, you have to be open to different points of view and opinions if you want to bridge gaps and close differences and create a pathway to peace.
Thank you very much. Francois?
I was very much struck in 1994 at the UN Summit for Social Development at the complete dialogue de sourds between the development people and the human rights people. The fact that the development people were portrayed by the human rights people as wanting to define community needs top-down, and the human rights people, I'm a human rights person, and the human rights people were portraying themselves as wanting to allow individuals to define how they want to express their own rights. I think portrayal was probably unfair for both sides, but there was a dialogue de sourds. We couldn't speak the same language. What I like in the development of mediation is that we're tackling at the same time the community level and the individual level. We have a process whereby we listen to individuals, trying to understand what their rights are, how they want to express themselves on what they want, and at the same time trying to define community needs, which can be across the different communities, like the example you were mentioning in Central Asia. And to me, mediation is precisely the kind of mechanism where you try to bridge the cultural divide. And if, again, that's one of the complexities you were describing. If you're interested in the rights discourse and the development discourse, that's one of the ways to make them actually work together.
Thank you. And Louise, a final word, final sage advice from your side?
I rarely give advice. And I don't support to receive advice too, so I'm in a neutral zone. What I would say that to be a mediator is a blessing, and when I implemented, just to give you, when I implemented judicial mediation at the Court of Appeal of Quebec 20 years ago, all judges were against that. Judges cannot mediate. What's that? And one of the strongest legal minds of my court accepted to conduct a mediation. And after the mediation, at the end of the afternoon, he came to my office and says, Louise, I feel so, blessed by what happened to me. I've never felt such an experience of my life. And he still is a great judge. So just the feeling of being in a mediation room or in a mediation area with conflicting parties and then help them alleviate their suffering, and knowing that mediation is just a step-by-step approach. If you feel like, I want to have permanent results, no, it's not for you. It's today that it's happened, and you know that it's the rule in our life. It should be the here and now. This is mediation.
Thank you very much. I think just a quick round of applause for our panelists and for the sage advice they've given us.
Wine and a reception.
Yeah, no, that's Phil there. Phil, I would like to pass the floor back to you for a final summation and then a call to our reception.
Yeah. So I'm not going to take a lot of time because I don't want to get in the way of you going to the reception. But there are a couple of things that I think really are worthy of highlighting. The first, and it is really, I think the first words that David said, is seen in the importance of this idea of mediating resource-related conflicts. The countries who are asking for help from UNEP are the countries that are the most conflictual, producing the most migrations that are coerced one way or the other. And to say that it's not relevant, it just seems like putting our head in the sand like the proverbial ostrich. Even if we just look at climate change, what do we know? We know, first of all, it's going to affect rainfall, water. We know, second of all, it's going to affect food security. But we also know that it's going to affect environment and resource extractive industries in two contradictory ways. On the one hand, what happens? Well, things like lithium and other rare earth metals suddenly become very, very important because that's one way of mitigating or reducing the impact of industrialization on the climate. The other thing that we often forget is what would happen if we were an oilless world? Well, Saudi Arabia would be in a big mess, and so would a lot of other countries, because of the huge impact, economically speaking, that resource extraction has. And so either way, we're going to likely see, and this is what we know, more conflicts. What we don't know is where they're going to be, what their intensity are, and how we can intervene most effectively to ensure that mediation is to ensure that climates don't escalate beyond our control. The second thing I want to emphasize is that for all of the panelists, it's quite clear that mediation is a process. And while the handbook is extremely useful in setting out the basic guidelines for what that process entails, it's also clear that the success of the process depends on knowing the context, being inclusive, being respectful of differences, and making a genuine effort to ensure that all voices are heard so that we can get to the root cause of the problem. It also means that, as the participants also said in different ways, the immediate conflict is often something that emerges because of underlying conflicts. And that has two important things that need to be emphasized from my perspective. The first is you can't ignore them. And so whether we're talking about migration or whether we're talking about conflict over the distribution of water or whatever it is, there's usually something more structural, more long-term underneath that. And to ignore that ultimately means that the effectiveness of the mediation will be limited. But at the same time, it also underscores the importance that mediation as a process is ongoing. It may never end, but it's the process itself that is often just as important for averting conflicts and minimizing violence. The fourth thing I want to say is asymmetry of power. And as Louise says, that may be less asymmetrical now than it ever was before. And to the extent that's true, it still we still should not forget that different kinds of power are often incommensurate. And so what does mediation do when it works in the way that the guidelines suggest it should? What it does is it levels the playing field, but it also helps make protests in some way commensurate with the power of economics, the power of knowledge, or other sources of power that different actors can bring together. So what it does is not only necessarily address direct asymmetries of power, but it helps make different forms of power commensurate and frames them in a way that, again, is intended implicitly, if not explicitly, to minimize future conflicts and to minimize violence. And I think finally, the last thing that we must remember is that what goes on locally has important implications nationally, but also internationally. And so while mediation often starts at the beginning, where we live, as a US congressman once said, all politics is local, the ramifications of that from the bottom up are often something that we forget. So when migrants leave because the community that they are living in is no longer hospitable towards them, automatically they start affecting other communities, and ultimately they may affect other countries with tremendous international implications. And so the importance of mediation begins where people live, but it extends all the way up to the very top, if you will, the pinnacles of power. And it's for all these reasons that I think we're at the moment of a real important opportunity for a collaboration between a university like McGill, the institute like the Institute for the Study of International Development, the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, and an organization like the UNEP. Because these complex issues require multiple disciplines, a long-term approach, and a recognition that we can't expect everything to change tomorrow, but with patience and following a good process, we're more likely to prevent tomorrow from being as bad as it might otherwise be. So with those words, I want to thank again the participants for a really enriching and enlightening and provocative series of presentations. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us in this conversation and welcome everyone to join us for a little bit of wine, cheese, and good conversation. So thank you all.
Here's my comments to the